What if I told you that buried in the pages of Genesis lies the account of history's most terrifying war? A conflict so ancient, so violent, that it involved not just kings and armies, but giants, beings of immense stature and supernatural origin, locked in combat with the most powerful empires of the ancient world. This isn't mythology, this isn't legend, this is Genesis 14. The Bible's first recorded international war, and at its center stands one man, Abraham. Not yet a patriarch, not yet the father of nations, but a shepherd named Abram, who would dare to challenge the darkness with nothing but 318 servants and an unshakable faith in the voice that called him from Ur. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of antiquity to uncover a battle that shook the foundations of the earth itself. Before Moses received the law, before David faced Goliath, before Egypt knew the plagues, there was this war. A conflict that swept across the land of Canaan like wildfire, where empires collided and the ground trembled beneath the feet of giants. The year was approximately 2000 BC. 4 mighty kings from the east had formed an alliance unlike anything the world had seen. For 12 long years they had held the cities of the Jordan Plain in brutal subjugation. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim and Bela, 5 wealthy city-states, forced to pay tribute to foreign overlords. But in the 13th year, something changed. The cities rebelled. What happened next would echo through the corridors of time, recorded not just in scripture, but whispered in the ancient texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Jubilees, and the mysterious traditions that speak of beings who once walked among men, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the giants whose very existence defied the natural order. These weren't ordinary times. The world still bore the scars of the Great Flood, yet somehow, impossibly, the bloodline of the giants had survived. And now, in the days of Abraham, they would face their greatest test. To understand this war, we must first understand the man who would become its unlikely hero. Abram, not yet Abraham, had left everything behind. The advanced city of Ur, with its ziggurats and idols, its commerce and luxury. He had heard a voice ancient and eternal, calling him to a land flowing with milk and honey. But Canaan was no paradise. It was a realm caught between light and darkness, where pagan altars dotted the landscape and ancient evils still held sway. Abram had settled near the terebinth trees of Mamre, close to Hebron, building altars to the Lord in a land that knew many gods but served few. The 4 kings who would soon march westward were not mere mortals drunk on power. They were the embodiment of earthly dominion at its most ruthless. Amraphel of Shinar, possibly the legendary Hammurabi himself, the great lawgiver whose code would influence civilizations for millennia. Arioch of Elazar, a warrior king whose name would later be associated with giant slaying in Jewish legend. Chedorlaomer of Elam, the true power behind the alliance, a man whose very name meant servant of Lagamar, an Elamite deity of war and conquest. And then there was Tidal, king of nations, perhaps the most mysterious of all. His title suggests dominion not over a single kingdom, but over a confederation of peoples. Some scholars whisper that among his forces marched beings of enormous stature, remnants of the antediluvian world. For 12 years these kings had maintained their iron grip over the rebellious cities, but rebellion, like a flame in darkness, cannot be contained forever. Here is where our story takes a turn that most never see, hidden in plain sight within the sacred text. Before confronting the rebellious cities, the four kings, embarked on what can only be described as a systematic extermination campaign. But their targets weren't ordinary tribes or settlements. Genesis 14:5 records their path of destruction. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shaveh-Kiriathaim. To the ancient mind, these names carried weight that few today can comprehend. The Rephaim, giants whose very name is sometimes used to describe the dead in Sheol, beings caught between worlds. The Zuzim, whose name means the mighty ones, roving creatures of immense power. The Emim, literally the terrifying ones, described by Moses himself as a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. This wasn't conquest for tribute or territory. This was something far more sinister. A purge of bloodlines that shouldn't have existed. Of beings whose very presence spoke of ancient rebellion against the natural order. Ancient Jewish sources, including the Book of Jubilees and certain Midrashic traditions, paint an even more startling picture. They speak of these regions as haunted by the memory of the Nephilim, those mysterious beings born when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men. The flood was meant to cleanse the earth of their corruption. Yet Genesis 6:4 contains those chilling words, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward." Somehow, impossibly, their legacy had survived. The four kings weren't just collecting taxes or suppressing rebellion. They were attempting to complete what the flood had begun. The eradication of a supernatural threat that had plagued humanity since the dawn of time. Armed with bronze weapons and disciplined armies, they carved through giant strongholds like a sword through shadow. But in doing so, they had awakened something they couldn't control. The spiritual realm itself began to stir, and at the center of the coming storm stood a man who served not earthly kings, but the King of heaven itself. When the dust settled over the valley of Siddim, when the armies of Sodom and Gomorrah lay broken, and their kings had fled into the wilderness, the victorious alliance began their march home, laden with spoils and captives. Among those captives was a man named Lot, Abraham's nephew, a soul who had chosen prosperity over purity, the well-watered plains over the presence of God. The news reached Abraham like a thunderclap in the desert. His family, his own flesh and blood, had been taken captive by the same kings who had just finished slaughtering giants across the breadth of Canaan. What happened next defies every military principle known to man. Abraham, the peaceful shepherd, the altar builder, the man of tents and flocks, transformed overnight into something the world had never seen, a warrior of faith. With 318 trained servants, men born in his own household, who had learned not just his ways but his unwavering trust in the Almighty, Abraham began a pursuit that borders on the impossible. He was chasing 4 royal armies who had just conquered entire regions, inhabited by giants. He was one man against an empire, but he wasn't truly alone. Under cover of darkness, Abraham divided his forces and launched the first recorded night raid in biblical history. Like shadows given flesh, his men struck at the heart of the enemy camp near Dan, then pursued the fleeing kings as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. The ancient texts whisper of something more than military strategy at work that night. They speak of supernatural intervention, of the very stars fighting in their courses, of confusion falling upon seasoned warriors like a plague. The God who had called Abraham from Ur, who had promised him descendants as numerous as the sand of the sea, now fought beside him in the darkness. By dawn, the impossible had occurred. 4 kings lay in ruins, their armies scattered like leaves before the wind, and Abraham stood victorious, not seeking glory or gold, but clutching the hand of his rescued nephew, surrounded by freed captives whose eyes reflected nothing but wonder at what they had witnessed. This wasn't merely a military victory, it was a declaration that echoed through the heavens themselves. The God of Abraham was not a regional deity, not a tribal protector, but the Lord of all creation, the one before whom even giants must fall. But perhaps the most mysterious moment of this entire saga was yet to come. As Abraham returned from his impossible victory, he encountered a figure who appears in Scripture like a whisper from eternity itself. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. No genealogy precedes him, no backstory explains his presence. He simply appears, bearing bread and wine, to bless the man who had just shattered the pride of empires. Here was a priest-king in a world where those roles were never combined. A man who served the same God as Abraham, in a land filled with pagan altars. The author of Hebrews would later write of this mysterious figure, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. In this encounter we glimpse something profound. A priesthood that existed before Moses, before Aaron, before the elaborate rituals of the tabernacle. A connection between heaven and earth that transcended bloodline and ceremony, pointing forward through the mists of time to another priest-king who would also offer bread and wine, who would also bless those who fought against darkness. Abraham, fresh from battle, recognized something in Melchizedek that demanded honor. He gave him a tenth of all the spoils, the first recorded tithe in Scripture, offered not out of law, but out of recognition of divine authority. The bread and wine that Melchizedek offered weren't mere symbols of hospitality, they were prophetic shadows of a greater communion to come, when another would take bread and wine and declare them symbols of a covenant written not in stone, but in blood shed for the redemption of the world. Why does this ancient war matter? Why should we care about kings and giants lost to the mists of antiquity? Because this battle was never truly about territory or tribute. It was about something far greater, the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between the kingdom of heaven and the principalities of this world. Abraham's victory over the four kings was a foreshadowing of every spiritual battle that would follow, from David facing Goliath to Christ confronting the powers of hell itself. The giants that fell in Abraham's day were more than flesh and bone. They represented the corruption that seeks to twist God's creation, the darkness that would steal, kill, and destroy everything touched by divine purpose. And Abraham's victory declared a truth that still echoes today, that God's people are never truly outnumbered, never truly alone, never truly defeated. When Abraham refused the king of Sodom's offer of reward, declaring that he would take nothing lest the world say that Sodom had made him rich, he established a principle that would define the faithful for generations to come. The servants of the Most High cannot be bought, cannot be corrupted, cannot be turned from their purpose by the glittering promises of this world. We live in days not unlike Abraham's, times when giants walk the earth in different forms, when darkness masquerades as light, when the faithful often feel outnumbered and overwhelmed. But the God who fought for Abraham still reigns. The same divine power that turned 318 servants into an army capable of defeating empires still moves in the hearts of those who dare to trust. The ancient war in the days of Abraham teaches us that giants fall, that darkness flees before light, that faith armed with divine purpose can overcome any earthly power. It reminds us that we are part of a story far greater than ourselves, participants in a cosmic drama that began in the garden and will culminate in the restoration of all things. In the end, Abraham's midnight raid was more than a rescue mission. It was a declaration of war against every force that would stand between God and his people, a battle cry that still echoes in the hearts of all who choose faith over fear, light over darkness, the eternal over the temporal. The war in the days of Abraham never truly ended. It continues in every heart that chooses to trust, every soul that dares to believe, every life that refuses to bow before the giants of this age. The question isn't whether the battle is real. The question is, which side will you choose?